Hi, this is Frank Marchand. You are listening to Bible Studies on Frank Viewology TV. All right, hello and welcome to another episode of Bible Studies. Today we're going to be covering Luke chapter 4, and this is where we see the start of Jesus beginning his earthly ministry. And we'll see the first section of Luke chapter 4, verses 1 to 13, pertains to Satan tempting Jesus in the wilderness. And so that's what we'll dive into first today. So in verse 2, we notice how there's this season of extreme spiritual devotion, where it's mentioned that Jesus is going into the wilderness for 40 days. And this harkens back to Old Testament references of Moses receiving the law from God on Mount Sinai, which was for 40 days. And also the prophet Daniel, he fasted for 40 days in the Old Testament. And so all of these instances between Moses on Mount Sinai and Daniel fasting, this signifies a season of extreme spiritual devotion to the will of God, in the same sense that Moses devoted himself to the will of God expressed through the law that was given on Sinai, and as well as the prophet Daniel devoting himself wholeheartedly to the will of the Lord through undergoing fasting for 40 days. Similarly, Jesus is surrendering himself and devoting himself completely to the will of the Father through this period of fasting in 40 days in the wilderness. And during this time, we see that Satan comes to tempt Jesus with a series of 3 temptations. So the first temptation that we see is in verse 3 to 4 is the temptation of bread. So Satan's first temptation to Jesus is a temptation of the flesh, pertaining to the outward physical flesh, and challenging his physical needs of hunger. Later on, Jesus says that the devil comes to steal, kill, and destroy. So you could say that for each temptation, each of the 3 temptations that Jesus gives of bread, worship, and his purpose, Satan came for one of each of these 3 motivations of stealing and killing and destroying Jesus. So in the case for bread, Satan tempted Jesus' physical body with food that would keep him alive outwardly, but at the expense of losing the purpose of his life. And so it would be killing Jesus with bread in order for him to bodily live, which would defy the very reason Jesus came to earth, which is to save humanity. And so Jesus quotes Deuteronomy 8, verse 3, referencing when God gave the Israelites manna from heaven to survive in the desert as they traveled to the promised land. And then the second temptation found in verses 5 to 8 is the temptation of worship. We see Satan's second temptation to Jesus is a temptation of the Spirit, challenging Jesus' spiritual status as God. And this can be viewed as a temptation motivated to steal Jesus' status as God for Satan himself, following another one of the 3 motivations of Satan of steal, kill, and destroy. And so Jesus quotes Deuteronomy 6, verse 13, from when Moses declares God's law to the Israelites, specifically reminding them of their exodus from Egypt and how they are to worship God alone and not idols from neighbors, since the Lord is a jealous God. All right, and then the final temptation that we see from verses 9 to 12 is the temptation of purpose. Satan's third temptation to Jesus is a temptation designed to manipulate circumstances at Jesus' expense for Satan's gain. This can be viewed as a temptation motivated to destroy Jesus' plan of salvation, tying into the 3 motivations of steal, kill, and destroy that Satan has. Because if Jesus jumped from the temple pinnacle and had angels rescue him, then the spectators would declare him as the Messiah, and Jesus would be enthroned as a king and not go down the path of crucifixion to atone for sins. So this would be an easy direction for Jesus to take, similar to what Jesus faced and prayed about in the Garden of Gethsemane later on. Jesus, however, replies by quoting Deuteronomy 6, verse 16. It's the same passage as the previous quote in the second temptation. It's a reminder of the Exodus. The message here basically is to say, don't tempt the Lord with shortcuts to achieve his plans at the expense of sparing God's planned sacrifice. And this kind of harkens back to Abraham offering Isaac and suggesting the Lord providing a goat instead. And so don't tempt the Lord with shortcuts. That's the takeaway from the third temptation. And then, as a result, in verse 13, it says that when the devil had finished every temptation, and this kind of highlights Jesus being our sympathetic high priest, and where some believe that Satan continued to tempt Jesus with every sin that mankind has ever faced, such as greed and lust and covetousness and others, so that Jesus walked out of the wilderness with the ability to relate to our condition of being tempted with sins that we face every day of our lives. And this ties back to Hebrews 4:15, where it said that, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but we have the one high priest in Jesus who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin." Okay, and so that's a understanding of Jesus' experience of temptation through the wilderness here. And then the next section we find in Luke 4, found in verse 14 to 30, is Jesus preaching in Nazareth. And first of all, it starts in verse 15 where Jesus comes to his hometown of Nazareth. And this is where Jesus finds some sense of consolation after experiencing a series of trials. So, Jesus' hometown is where he grew up, in Nazareth. And after undergoing such a tremendously difficult experience in the wilderness, dealing with Satan, tempting him directly, no doubt there was a level of comfort there in Nazareth for Jesus, and refreshing for Jesus to return to his home. Okay, and then in verse 16, we see it mentioned where Jesus goes to the synagogue on the Sabbath. And so the Sabbath in Jewish culture takes place on Saturdays. It's not on Sundays. Sundays are the holy day of the week that was developed around the time of Emperor Constantine, around the 4th century AD, as Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and there were changes to calendars and holidays and other dates as well. But the concept of the Sabbath as a day of rest, it stems from Genesis, when God rested on the 7th day after creating the universe. And the Sabbath has been practiced as early as the times of Moses among the Israelites, when God commanded the nation of Israel from Sinai and the 10 Commandments to observe one day of the week to rest from work and labor. And as time went on, Jewish leaders would debate what activities would be counted as work on the Sabbath, whether there was traveling or moving of items or other tasks. And this was a subject of much debate during Jesus' time among rabbis in Judea and Galilee, arguing about what constitutes as work on the Sabbath, so as to not break the Sabbath and break the commandment to rest. All right, and then next in verse 18 to 19, we see the theme of Israel's messianic hopes answered in their present moment. So Jesus quotes Isaiah 61 verses 1 to 2, which was originally written for Israelites that were suffering from the Babylonian captivity and exile that were taken out from their homeland of Israel. And this message from Isaiah 61 was meant to encourage the Jewish people at the time of Isaiah and encourage them that there is hope despite the dire circumstances that they faced from the Babylonian captivity and exile. So Jesus is saying that the Messianic era that Isaiah prophesied to Israelites about while they were suffering exile under Babylon, that Messianic era that was prophesied is being fulfilled now in their lifetime, which is tremendously uplifting for Jewish people, since they viewed the Roman occupation of the Holy Land as either an adversary for God's people to be free from, like the extreme zealots would view against the Roman Empire, or that Romans have come as a means of God's judgment upon the Jewish people for their sins, similar to how Babylonians were used for the exiled Israelites in Isaiah's time as a means of judgment from God. And so Jesus isn't wasting time trying to paint the Romans as villains in either sense, trying to fit into either view, whether they're a tool of God's judgment or a force of oppression that God's people need to be liberated from. Jesus doesn't waste time arguing about that, but instead Jesus focuses on the messianic prophecies that were promised to God's people, and that being fulfilled now in their lifetime from Isaiah 61. And so despite the presence of pagan Romans in Judea and Galilee, God is not only working to give hope for his people of Israel that the Messianic era is coming, but God is fulfilling the hope of the Messianic era now in their present lifetime through Jesus. And then in verse 24, it gives reference to the rabbinic authority of Jesus, and which Jesus says, "Truly I say to you." So no other rabbi taught with their own authority or relied on their own name to teach. All of the other rabbis would teach in the name of another rabbi that they learned from, such as saying something along the lines of Rabbi Ishmael would say, or in the words of Rabbi Jonathan, and so on. So this is why the people would keep saying he taught as one with authority, because Jesus did not teach using other rabbis' teachings, but only on his own teachings and his own authority and his own name, and not on the names of other rabbis before him. In fact, to teach on your own authority and not on the shoulders of other rabbis from previous generations would suggest you viewed yourself at the same level as God's word itself, which would be rather heretical for anyone to do except for Jesus, because clearly he is God incarnate. So that is a tremendous insight to the authority of Jesus through his teaching, especially in a rabbinic culture. And so then in verse 26 and 27, Jesus talks about how miracles are provided at God's discretion and giving examples of some obscure names such as Zarephath and Naaman. And so both Zarephath and Naaman were Gentiles. They weren't Jewish people. They lived outside of the land of Israel in the lands of Phoenicia and Aram or Syria. And these miracles of God for these Gentiles of Zarephath and Naaman, these miracles happened for people who weren't God's people and who weren't native to the promised land of Israel. They did not deserve the miracles that happened to them. All right, so when it comes to Zarephath and the miracle that's given to them, this is referencing a story mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 9. And this is a story where Elijah is told by God that there would be a drought in the land and a famine. So God told Elijah, the prophet, first to stay in the desert near a river, and God would send ravens to feed Elijah meat in order to live. And after that, God told the prophet Elijah to go to a person named Zarephath in their house, and God would provide Elijah with food there at Zarephath's house. However, Zarephath didn't even have enough dough to make bread for herself and her son. But God blessed Zarephath with a miracle so the dough would not run out until the drought and famine ended. So Jesus is saying that just because God provides miracles wherever Elijah went, it doesn't mean that the miracles that come with God's prophet deserve to belong to everyone he meets. Miracles do not belong to everyone at all the time, but miracles are only provided according to God's discretion and specific sovereign plan. All right, and similarly with Naaman, this is referencing a story from 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 1 to 14. And Naaman was a captain of an Aramean army, but Naaman had leprosy. So Naaman had a waitress from Israel that was a Jewish waitress, and this waitress told Naaman that he should go see Israel's prophet to be healed from leprosy. So Naaman sent a letter to Israel's king to ask for healing from leprosy. And the king of Israel didn't want Naaman to come to his palace because his leprosy would defile the king's home. And the prophet Elisha at the time didn't want to risk exposure to leprosy and become defiled either. So they sent a message to Naaman to simply go to dip himself into the Jordan River 7 times in order to be healed. And this was the prophet Elijah's instructions. And at first, Naaman was upset that Elisha wouldn't come to touch him to be healed of leprosy, and that there were other rivers that were cleaner than the Jordan River to be used for healing. But eventually, Naaman conceded, and he was healed. And so Jesus, again, is using this example to reiterate that miracles do not belong to everyone all the time, but miracles are only given according to God's sovereign plan and the discretion of God. All right, and so this pertains to the issue of entitlement from this people of Nazareth. So the problem was that the Nazarenes assumed that since Jesus was born and raised in their hometown of Nazareth, that they deserved to have miracles as much as the people of Capernaum or at Cana, which weren't Jesus' hometown, because if Jesus could make water into wine in Cana, which was considered the first miracle of Jesus, then there should be a revival outbreak for his friends and family in his hometown. And the people of Nazareth, they thought that they deserved miracles because they grew up with Jesus. They helped to raise Jesus when he was young, and they helped Jesus achieve whatever he needed communally. And they supported him in ways that people in Capernaum and Cana didn't do for Jesus while he was growing up. So Nazareth, they thought that they deserved to have miracles in abundance. However, Jesus is saying that God's gift of miracles aren't given because people deserve them, but because of what God's sovereign plan holds for his people. The entitlement of the Nazarenes is what made them upset with Jesus and refusing to give the miracles, and this is part of the reason why they chased Jesus out from the town and city. All right? And then we see in Luke verses 31 to 37 in Luke chapter 4, we see Jesus do an exorcism in the city of Capernaum. And this also echoes and is an account that's also shared in Mark chapter 1, verse 21 to 28. And so what we see is a subject dealing with unclean spirits, as well as Jesus' authoritative practice of exorcism. So in verse 33, it talks about unclean spirits. And in the New Testament, there are evil spirits and there are unclean spirits. It may be that there is a difference between evil spirits and unclean spirits, where evil spirits may deal with ethically immoral behavior, while unclean spirits might only deal with ritualistic and hygienic laws that are based on Old Testament law. And either way, their presence is antithetical to the presence of a holy God, especially in the person of Jesus. And so this is the reason why they have no business to be with each other. The mindset of someone possessed by an evil or unclean spirit has a different agenda and different purpose and goal than what Jesus has for his plans and his goals and purposes. So Jewish exorcists weren't an entirely new phenomenon by the time of Jesus' earthly ministry. There's several examples of Jewish exorcists in antiquity around the times of the New Testament, such as in the books of Tobit, chapter 3, verse 17, as well as the Jewish historian Josephus in his book of Jewish Wars, chapter 7, verse 185, as well as Josephus' Book of Antiquities in chapter 8, verse 45 to 49, and also in the Essene Qumran Dead Sea Scroll text of regarding a book of Genesis, chapter 10, verse 16 to 29. And so the difference is that the instance which was new for Jewish audiences regarding exorcism was the authority which Jesus upheld in the process of casting out demons. Jesus used his own authority and commanded the unclean spirit rather than invoking a formulaic incantation which would be passed down from someone else. Okay, so the difference and uniqueness in Jesus' ministry as opposed to other Jewish exorcists at the time of the New Testament was that Jesus utilized his own authority in his own name to cast out unclean spirits and demons, as opposed to other Jewish exorcists that use formulas and incantations to cast out unclean spirits and demons. So that really highlighted Jesus being very different from everybody else and kind of lended to the idea of Jesus being God incarnate for everybody else to witness. And so then continuing on in Luke chapter 4, verse 38 to 44, we see Jesus healing at Simon's home. And this is also referenced in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 8, verse 14 to 17. And what we see in verse 38 is a growing group of disciples. In verse 38, it talks about Simon's home, and this is referencing Simon Peter, also named Cephas. And we see Peter's call to discipleship in Matthew 4:18-22, and also in Luke 5:1-11. And Jesus, calls Peter by saying, I will make you a fisher of men. And Jesus also calls Peter's brother, Andrew, to be his disciple, as well as James and John, who are the sons of Zebedee, also known as the sons of thunder, and it illustrates their charismatic personality. And according to the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 43-51, this is also the same instance and around the same time when Jesus calls Philip, who is from Bethsaida, which is also the same city that Peter and Andrew were from, as well as Nathanael. So this makes for 6 disciples who are already disciples by this time in Jesus' ministry, out of which they will become part of the 12 apostles later on. Okay? And then in verse 41 of Luke chapter 4, we see distractions from the Heavenly Father's plan. So it said that he would not allow them to speak, all right? And Jesus would not allow the unclean spirit to speak. This ties back to the temptation Jesus had from Satan in the wilderness, in the desert, about jumping from the temple to be caught by angels. Jesus turned down the temptation in this instance because he did not want people to know that he was the Messiah. It was premature, all right? And for the people to make him a king by force, which would distract Jesus from his mission from the Father of sacrificing himself to atone for mankind's sins. When demons are shouting that Jesus is the Messiah at the time during his earthly ministry, they are trying to divert the plan and purpose of God by getting the people to enthrone Jesus as the Messianic king before Jesus ever gets the chance to offer himself up for the sins of the world. Okay? And so then continuing on in verse 42, we see Jesus go to a secluded place. And this refers to a practice of solitude that serves to refuel in order to provide more stronger ministry. So as followers of God, there are times when we are to give and share the gospel to many people. And then there are also times when we are called to isolate ourselves in order to hear and receive from the Lord, and so that we can be prepared for what's next. All right? And Jesus is taking time to recharge himself spiritually. And after ministering with healings and exorcisms and preachings, to refresh himself spiritually for doing more ministry again soon afterwards. This is an example of a spiritual discipline called solitude, and I would recommend checking out Richard Foster's book called Celebration of Discipline, where he demonstrates and lists out several spiritual disciplines like prayer, fasting, meditation, worship, studying, in addition to solitude. And so spiritual disciplines like solitude, they help us to be equipped and prepared to minister effectively to the people around us as we work to follow the Lord and expand his kingdom in this world without suffering from any type of personal burnout. Okay? And so this has been Luke chapter 4. All right, and so I hope you've been blessed and got something special away from this study in Luke chapter 4. And stay tuned for the next lesson. All right, thanks for tuning in. Take care and have a good day. God bless. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Bible Studies on Frank Viewology TV. You can support this channel by hitting the like button, comment, subscribe, and share the link with others. Take care and have a blessed day.